Good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Wellbeing series webinar on anti-racism work. My name is Molly Buss, and I'm the Community Relations Manager at the Earl E. Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing. And my role for this webinar is to moderate the chat. So as you get settled, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, perhaps sharing where you are joining us from or what you are excited to learn about today. I also want to give a quick introduction to the Bakken Center for those who may not be familiar with our work. It is our vision to advance the health and well-being of individuals, organizations, and communities through integrative health and healing. And during the COVID-19 pandemic, we have strived to provide free resources and webinars to help you navigate these challenging times. And we need your help to continue to do this work. So if you're able to, please consider making a donation of any amount, and more information about how to do that will be provided in the post-webinar email. There are a few logistical items I want to review to help you navigate the webinar functions. You're welcome to share your thoughts and comments via the chat box. And if you're comfortable and do want to share your introduction or other thoughts with all participants, please make sure to update the to field in the chat box to all panelists and attendees. And then just note that you do have the opportunity to minimize the chat box during the presentation. And we invite for you to do that during the components that aren't interactive to help you remain present. Finally, there is a Q&A icon where you can submit your questions, and we will ask our presenter, Nicole, as many as we have time for at the end of the session. If you aren't able to find those icons, hover your mouse over the bottom of your webinar screen and they should pop up for you. We will send out an email with a recording of the webinar and other resources later this afternoon, so watch for that. I am now delighted to introduce Dr. Mary Jo Kreitzer, founder and director of the Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing. Mary Jo will be facilitating the Q&A segment and will also share some more information about our presenter, Nicole Cardoza.
Thank you very much, Molly, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing webinar. As Molly said, I'm Mary Jo Kreitzer, the founder and the director of the Bakken Center. For 25 years, we've been advancing health and well-being in people, organizations, and communities. We are very excited to be hosting as our speaker today, Nicole Cardoza, who will be speaking on anti-racism work, dismantling your practice. At the Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing, we know that racism, oppression, and societal disregard for the experience of marginalized people are significant barriers to well-being. And we recognize that it's our responsibility to ensure that diverse opinions and unique ways of knowing inform our curriculum, operations, research, and community relations. Along with other university partners, we acknowledge that there is a great deal of work to be done within our community and the university to counter systemic racism. We are committed to addressing this issue and expanding our programming, resources, and websites to feature more information about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and why all are critical components of well-being. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. We're so excited to have Nicole Cardoza with us. Nicole is an award-winning serial social entrepreneur, investor, author, and public speaker. Her work is dedicated to closing the racial and socioeconomic divides in the wellness industry, which she has done by investing more than $3 million in direct funding, programs, and other resources into communities that need it the most. A former yoga instructor in schools, Nicole saw the positive outcomes of integrating yoga and mindfulness into the school day. In 2014, she left a career in the tech industry to pursue her nonprofit work full-time. Since then, she has reached over 1,500 educators in 500 schools, and she has a children's book coming out March 30th titled Mindful Moves. Last summer, Nicole launched a daily newsletter aptly named Anti-Racism Daily. The goal is to provide education and actions to dismantle white supremacy. There are currently well over 100,000 subscribers. She describes the newsletter as a form of self-care, not just for herself personally, rather as a form of community self-care. She hopes to prevent communities of color from being harmed by microaggressions and tokenism. Nicole has been recognized as one of the most influential change makers in wellness by Forbes, Well Plus Good, and Wanderlust. And she routinely speaks on social impact, equity, and health at foundations such as the Aspen Institute, universities such as Harvard, and now the University of Minnesota, and speaks to Fortune 500 companies, including Nike and Lululemon. Before welcoming Nicole, I just want to note that she is in Texas right now. Our care and concern goes out to all in Texas who are being impacted by the brutal weather and harsh conditions. And we thank you, the participants, in advance for your understanding should Nicole experience any technical difficulties. With that, welcome, Nicole.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for joining here today. I am honored to be joining you all, especially with everything going on. So thank you for your patience and thank you for being here. Let me just pull up my screen. But before I do, actually, my name is Nicole Cardoza. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm coming to you from Dallas, Texas, which is land originally settled and occupied by the Caddo, Wichita, and Comanche indigenous people. So I want to take a moment to honor and recognize their stewardship and their leadership, and recognize the forced removal of all indigenous communities through the legacy of colonization. I am standing in front of my screen right now. I am wearing a light gray turtleneck and headphones, and there is a vase of flowers behind me and a television. I also just want to take a moment to acknowledge the pain, the grief, the trauma that so many people here are experiencing in Texas right now. You can't see I'm wearing 3 pairs of pants and 3 pairs of socks as we're chatting. And so I'm sending my love to anybody listening right now from Texas as well. I know it's quite a difficult situation. So I'm here to chat a little bit about anti-racism, dismantling our practice. Let me see if I can get this slide up, and I hope everybody can see that. If you have any questions or inquiries during this presentation, I highly recommend you to add them to the Q&A. I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with you a bit more later in this work. If you've been following my work, you know that I'm one of many people that like to learn out loud. My anti-racism daily newsletter is a space for me to process, to learn, to listen from organizers on the ground, and to get familiar not just with what's happening in its historical context, but how we collectively can take action. And so this is just an offering of that too. This is where I am, where I'm learning, and where I'm coming from. But as my experience as a Black queer woman who's been working in the wellness space, who's been working in the wellness industry, and who is passionate about our collective well-being. And so like I said, I'm really excited to have your perspectives in that as well. You will have access to these slides after the presentation, and this presentation will be recorded. And so my work with anti-racism started from the lens of the wellness industry. Like you heard before in my bio, I've been working in the wellness industry for the past decade. I got inspired to work in the wellness industry because of my work in schools, introducing yoga and mindfulness and other forms of movement into the classroom. And what I found is what I think a lot of us may know, what a lot of you may know from learning about well-being here at the center, is that wellness is not a practice, not an opportunity designed for everybody. I think that's something that we're also seeing here in Texas right now, is that it's inherently quite difficult to be well. And so whenever I start talking about my work in wellness, I like to name that wellness, the space that we're in, is inherently unwell on a lot of levels. One, because wellness space, like many other industries, many other practices, is operating in a world of systemic oppression. A lot of my work that I'll talk about today is rooted in the United States. So I'm talking both about like the political, social, and economic systems of the United States, but also the dominant culture and the dominant belief of the United States. So that makes a space for wellness to be housed in a place that is inherently unwell. But we also need to realize that the wellness industry grew here in the United States because of systemic failures, because of a deep distrust in the healthcare system, because of increasing in economic inequities, because of decreased access to the most foundational elements for us to stay well. And so as we talk about wellness and well-being, we just need to name that it right now, although that we all, including myself, have great intentions, we're oftentimes operating in a space that's inherently unwell. And what we see communicated often in the wellness space are ideas that are reflective of dominant culture and oppressive views, views and perspectives that do not elevate the well-being of everyone. Oftentimes in the wellness space, we hear individual practices being promoted. The idea that I should roll out my mat and do yoga, right? It's my practice on my mat in my body and my space. Similar to what you might see with other forms of popular wellness practices like meditation. You also see that with some of the products and services that are provided. It's usually one-on-one. Oftentimes, one-on-one practices are more exclusive, more expensive, more coveted in this space. We also see a very prescribed approach when we hear about wellness practices in the United States. You should meditate for 10 minutes every single morning to be able to achieve your goals. You need to follow this lineage and this practice and these people, be wearing these pants, be, in relationship with these ideas, these brands. It often carries a message of personal responsibility. It is up to me to wake up early every day to find time to be able to practice. It is up to me to eat healthy foods that will keep me well. It's up to me to continue to learn and connect with these practices, to find transportation to get to the studios, and to find resources to be resourced in order to participate. Wellness is oftentimes also goal-oriented, which means that we're not just doing it for doing it, right? The way that it's communicated to us is not just meditating for 10 minutes a day, but meditating to feel less stressed, to be more calm, using nutrition as a form of keeping ourselves well. There should be a goal, a number of pounds lost at the end, some added muscle, a lower BMI. Now all of these things are not inherently bad, right? There's many things that you might see on here, like having a practice that makes you feel really whole, having a space that feels yours in a world that oftentimes takes space away from us. So this in itself doesn't mean on an individual level it is harmful. It also doesn't mean it's harmful to have goals, right? Like having a goal to make sure that you're taking care of yourself isn't isn't wrong. It's okay to want to make those goals to stay well. But what this does, and what we see in so many aspects of our culture and our society, is it places individual responsibility on collective and interconnected shortcomings, right? Because what we often don't see promoted when we talk about wellness and talk about our path to well-being is how we're navigating in a system that is constantly taking that away from us. And so what oftentimes happens is for those, particularly those most marginalized, may feel shame, burden, stress, discomfort, right? For not being able to participate or have access to, or to see the goals that are prescribed by this space, right? It also completely discredits that the wellness industry is operating in a space of deep systemic inequities, especially when it goes to our health and our well-being. Because our health and well-being depends on some of the most foundational access to shelter, to food, to clean water. We can't meditate our way out of that. There is no deep breathing that will be able to keep us warm when 40% of Austin, Texas right now does not have power. And so it's important for us to unpack this when we talk about racism work, because racism work is embedded in the notion, right? Racism is embedded in the notion that we're living in a world where everybody has the same opportunities, something that's promoted through this practice. We also have the notion of self-care. Now, I believe deeply in individual taking care of myself. I think many of us do too. And I think that is a gift that the idea of self-care has become so popularized over the past few years. But oftentimes, in the similar way as what we discussed before, self-care can be weaponized to believe that we need to take care of ourselves at the expense of our community. And that taking care of ourselves is a way, if we take care of ourselves, we are keeping our community well. It promotes this idea that we can all kind of operate on our own in this society. And if I have, therefore you have, without acknowledging the we. The example I like to say is, self-care can be waking up early in the morning, meditating for a few minutes, and then making your green juice. And that's a great practice. But what we oftentimes forget is that my ability to do those things in the morning can only happen because of the community that lives with me, right? Because my apartment has the power for me to be able to turn on a light and be able to start my meditation practice, right? There's utilities, there's people running those utilities, there's people paying for those utilities that made that possible. I mean, this is not possible for me at my apartment right now, which is the irony of it, but I think you understand what I'm saying. You could have a conversation about having a green juice and the importance of having healthy vegetables. But that conversation cannot be completely disconnected from the entire growing process and the distribution process of our food, the labor of getting that food from point A to point B. And so instead of thinking about self-care at the expense of the community, I like to think about community care as self-care, right? Because truly I can be well when I know that the people that are delivering the food and making it possible for me to have food in my community are also well. And if we continue to think that self-care can come at the expense of the community, we only continue to perpetuate a system of oppression. And so this work for me was, when I started wellness, when I got into the wellness space, I didn't know this. All I knew is that the things that I was learning in the industry weren't changing the systemic issues in my community. They were just offering maybe ways to practice through the symptoms to minimize or alleviate the symptoms. I started this work. I'm grateful that I got to start this work working in the public education system in New York City. And as wonderful as this practice was in our schools and continues to be in our schools, we need to have a broader conversation around the stress, the anxiety, the trauma that is both created and exacerbated in our school system. And so that's what I'm here to talk to you all about today. That's how I got into this work. And as a Black woman running organizations in this space, this conversation really became unavoidable for me. It also became really unavoidable for me because of how our system as a whole, particularly the wellness industry, responds to racism. If you have a mindfulness practice, we're going to get into the difference between being in a responsive and a reactive state. But if you think about the conversations around racism in America, they're usually prompted from a very reactive state. And I know you all know this really deeply if you're based in Minnesota, that the murder of George Floyd set this country, I hear there's a sound problem, I'll try to keep myself louder, that this country had a conversation about racism in a very reactive state to a very violent national conversation. And since then has been trying to reconcile and repair from a reactive state. We'll talk a little bit about the difference, the basics of most mindfulness practices, the difference between the stimulus and the response. And when we get into this relationship, thank you for the sound notes. It's really helpful. Again, so thank you. In most mindfulness practices, we're focusing on the relationship between the stimulus and the response in the individual body, right? John Kabat-Zinn and MBSR talks a lot about the work of separating, creating space and distance between what happens and how we respond to it. And in those moments, when we react to anything in our lives on an individual level in a very reactive state, I want you to think about that, how that happened to you last in your own body. How do you feel when you're in a state of reaction? Maybe notice or reflect on any physical sensations that you might feel. How your breath moves through your body. So people are putting in the comments an increased heart rate, panic or confusion, shallow breathing. Right. In a lot of mindfulness practices, I get hot. Yeah, that's another one. Thank you, Lee Pen. So in those moments, we tend to come into it in a space where we might not feel fully comfortable or engaged or connected, whatever that term is for you, with our bodies. We know from a physiological perspective, we also tend to come in that fight, flight, or freeze mode. I've also heard fawn mode. You know, we're ready to run in one direction or the other. You know, we clench our fists if that's available to you. You know, our blood goes to our extremities. Our brain deprioritizes our long-term memory to give us just the rapid responses that we need in that moment. And so when we are in that moment on an individual level, it takes a toll from our bodies. We oftentimes might not show up in those moments as resourced as we may choose. Y'all with me? The exact same thing happens collectively, you know, as a unified body on a societal level. When we respond to decades old, centuries old issues in a very reactive state. And so I think you can imagine, and if you've been reading the news or reading our newsletter, how a lot of harm can happen when we respond to racism from a reactive state. Because just as we are as individuals when we feel threatened as a collective, we oftentimes try to get to safety as quickly as possible. Just as we are as individuals, as a society, we tend to try to alleviate the immediate issue instead of thinking about the system and the problem as a whole. Talk about the saber-toothed tiger perspective. If you were running away from a saber-toothed tiger, if your body is responding to that, its main goal is immediate safety from that one saber-toothed tiger. It doesn't mean that you're not going to run into a den filled with saber-toothed tigers, because that wasn't the issue on hand. And so it actually can put you in a place of further harm because it's looking at responding to that moment in time. A very great thing for our survival, but not necessarily a good practice for our collective sustainability. And so if we are going to do anti-racism work, from the rootedness of our well-being, we have to start thinking about it as a proactive response. We have to start thinking about how can we do this work rooted and resourced and ready beyond the times that it feels like an immediate threat. Right? So that's what I'm going to talk about here. And what you'll notice is that when we do this work from a more rooted lens, we also transform our idea and our definition of well-being, because it changes and defines our relationship to most spaces that we occupy. It changes our definition of being goal-oriented to process-oriented. It changes our idea of doing things for ourselves, for our own immediate, to eliminate our own immediate needs to get to that goal, to doing something that shows all of us. So it starts with a re-examination of what you see on this slide. And if you're not seeing slides, that's totally fine. There's just two pictures with two circles that say stimulus and response, and they're kind of far apart to show that there's some distance here. What we need to do is look at both sides. Under the stimulus section of this slide, it just says, how are we processing the stimulus we receive, right? We're going to get into that. And then the response. How do we respond equitably? How do we respond rooted, resourced, and ready? How do we respond in a way that's really important, that we're not replicating the same system, right? Because here's the other thing, I'm going off track, but here's the other thing. If you always are prepared to respond to the most immediate need, if you're always running away from that one saber-toothed tiger, like I said, you don't know where you're running into. You don't know if you're running into a den, but you're leveraging the same practice to solve that immediate issue. So you're not going to see a systemic change, right? You're not going to see yourself create a new pattern where that you never run into that saber-toothed tiger again. So we talk about this a lot in the mindfulness space, right? Recreating new patterns, creating new behaviors, teaching ourselves and unlearning what we already know to have a more proactive response. But it's necessary if we want to create new systems and structures, not just on the individual level, but if we actually want to recreate and reshape the world that we live in. And I think if you are on this call, you want to do that. And that's why I'm on this call, right? We want to recreate the space that we in. We want to reimagine a world where we don't have to talk about anti-racism. I say a lot, people ask me, how long am I going to write this newsletter? We write one email every day to dismantle white supremacy. And I say, I'm going to keep writing it until it is no longer relevant. What a joy, what a jubilation that day would be if I could wake up one morning and to feel like there's nothing to write about. There's nothing, there's nothing to do. There's no action items. There's no communities in dire need. Okay, so we're going to go back to what I said before. We're going to relook at some of the practices that are in the wellness space. Now, spoiler alert, what we're talking about that's happening in the wellness industry is oftentimes happening in many industries, is oftentimes happening in many lenses of your work. So you can do this with me from your own worldview and maybe identify some of the same patterns. But again, I'm just going to talk from where I am. So we talked a lot about how wellness has a lot of individual practices. So what would it look like if we thought that our practices in this space were a collective practice? That every time, for example, as a yoga teacher, as a yoga practitioner, I sit on my mat and I'm not just thinking about how my body feels and how my butt looks in my pants, but I'm thinking about how does my participation here affect the room? How does my perspective on yoga shape its lineage, shape its history? How am I honoring and rooting myself into this practice beyond just my own 2 feet, right? And so how can we start shaping both our practice in wellness and our practice as a whole to be less about the I and more about the we? And just to name here, I think about not just who's immediately around me, right? Who's in this house, who's in this neighborhood, but other people like me, the communities I represent, you know, from my identities, the people that have come before me, then the people that follow, you know? So it's not just about like who's physically in the room, you know, who you can see or sense, but your connection to the broader community. There's a million examples. I'm going to go into this. I'm going to keep going because we're going to get into this a bit more. How can we go from a prescribed approach, right, to an emergent approach? So in wellness, the example is like, okay, I meditate 10 minutes a day and that should help. I eat greens and that should help me get to my goal, another thing. But how can we allow for our practices to be responsive to the world that we live in? All right, really silly example. I always used to think I had to wake up every morning and do a mindfulness practice. I know that that helps me in my body, you know, but I'm staying at somebody's house right now. I don't know when I'll be able to go back home. I'm tired. So for me, forcing myself to wake up in the morning and doing yoga, is that actually going to help my body? Maybe not, right? Like maybe what I need right now is more sleep. Maybe I need to feel a little bit more grounded somewhere, warmer in my body. It's silly, you know, simplistic example, but still, like, how can we shape an emergent approach in our practice, our wellness practice? And how can we think about that as a whole, right? How can we go from personal responsibility to collective responsibility? This is huge, right? Not just, I have to take care of myself for me, right? But I will take care of ourselves for us. We will take care of each other. This might change everything you know alone about wellness, right? Here's the thing I have not stopped thinking about a single fucking day since Eric Gardner, is that we talk so much in wellness in my work about breath. But what does it matter about how deeply I can breathe if law enforcement takes away my opportunity to, right? How important is it for me to cultivate my own practice of welcoming my breath back into my body with every inhale, inviting it out with every exhale? I need to recognize that for my own well-being. That is a necessary practice, and it cannot live in a world and operate in a world where law enforcement is allowed to do that, when law enforcement is encouraged to do that. We saw that again with George Floyd. Breath is one of the most foundational elements, or one of the most profoundly impacted parts of our body because of COVID. So you can look at it in that same lens. It doesn't matter how many green juices I drink. And I know I'm giving green juices a little bit of a slight here. I like green juice, but it doesn't matter what that practice is if I'm operating in a world of a global pandemic where my exhales, literally my exhales, can get somebody else sick. So what is our collective responsibility to breath? Not just the individual, not just knowing breath control, not just reminding myself to breathe in this moment, like that is important. I'm not taking that away from us, but how does that translate to my responsibility to reimagine public safety so Black men can breathe, so Black women can breathe, so Black disabled bodies can breathe, right? So the elderly can breathe and go to the grocery store. And then instead of thinking about goal-oriented work, right, which we see a lot in movement, or sorry, we see a lot in yoga and in mindfulness and in, you know, exercise. I got to run 6 miles at the end of the day. I'm doing this to lose weight. I like to think about this as movement oriented. How can I have a practice that enables me to respond, to change, to transform, you know? And I use the word movement here on a couple of levels. One, because I like that it's physical movement and I'm a yoga teacher. Because I like the idea of our goals or our benchmarks being amorphous to the moment. But I also think that actual movement work that we see in our communities in terms of political change, in terms of economic change, in terms of mutual aid relief, it in itself is a wellness practice. Because the people that are offering the most well-being right now in Austin, Texas, are loosely organized groups of individuals that are rallying to get people groceries, who are standing in line for the elderly communities, right? And I can guarantee you that those organizations weren't doing exactly the same work than they were doing yesterday, right? They didn't wake up 2 years ago and set a goal to be responsive today in this moment. They didn't know that this was going to happen. And so I like to think of this idea as movement, right? And I see some people in the comments saying some stuff, freedom of movement versus restrictions. Goals are important. Yes, having a goal and having an outcome and having a vision that we're working towards is important, and it can restrict us, right, from being responsive. We see that a lot in our politics, you know? It's like, well, we're going to get there in a few years. And so what's happening now is okay. It's just part of it, right? So movement-oriented, amorphous, transformative work here. You can use your own names. There's a ton of incredible frameworks. A lot of my work is inspired by emergent strategy and the work of Adrienne Marie Brown. And so you can find your own space here, but that's what I'm sticking with today. This is where I want to go. And I also want to name this idea of deprioritizing the vision so we can acknowledge the view. Because this is a huge thing, I think, that is a barrier just for anti-racism work as a whole, but it's particularly when it shows up in the intersection of our well-being, as we get really excited about where we think we're going. But sometimes that means we're not paying attention to the here and the now. Thank you for naming Adrienne Marie Brown's book. So how can we, I know that we're heading somewhere. I think we're all here for a reason on this call, right? But how can we be really paying attention to what is so we can be present here? Another mindfulness, foundational practice, but oftentimes does not come up in how we're responding to change or how we're advocating for change. And so I like to think about like acknowledging the view, acknowledging this moment, being present with a few different phrases. And what I encourage you to do, these are some of mine that I come back to all the time to root myself here. But I encourage you, if this is really interesting to you, to start to write your own. Because I'm a big picture person. I like to, create companies. I'm a very vision-oriented individual, but I can lose sight of it today. So this is a personal thing I do. It doesn't matter that we want to go to a place where we're all, it does. It matters that we're all going to a place where we'll have a more liberatory view, that we treat people equally. But where we are right now is that we're operating from different values, different privileges, perspectives, lived experiences, and identities. That's where we are right now, right? Just as much as my 2 feet are rooted here on the indigenous, on the lands of the indigenous people here in Texas, that's where we are right now, right? I can't bypass, what that brings up in my life. Right now, there are multiple and just not one truths. Another thing that's taught and promoted in white supremacy, that there's one right, that there's one way. There's multiple ways that we live. There's multiple ways that we can hold a space for all of us to be well. And I have to sit in the nuances of that. I sit a lot in the nuances of being a Black woman colonizing land in a country that I didn't choose to be in. There's multiple truths there, right? So holding the space for the complexity there is important. Holding the space for the truths here are important. Acknowledging them brings more people into the conversation. There is no right or perfect. A lot of people believe that if we're working towards a singular vision, there is one way to get there, and that we can't show up until we are clear and we're right, So there's no rights, there's no perfects, there's the best that we can do in a moment, right? We'll get into that a little bit more. It's actually at the bottom. There's suffering and there's joy here, similar to the multiple truths. A lot of liberatory work will be celebratory. We'll talk about the celebration, and that sometimes can bypass the suffering that exists for being a human, right? If you believe that, humans all have suffering in their lives, I don't want to, prescribe any belief system on you, but there's certainly suffering, in this moment. We can work towards an ideal future, and we are in one that is vastly inequitable today. And so we can't continue, or it would be remiss for us to continue to work towards that without acknowledging this harm. hear a lot of those conversations around people talking about flying to the moon. It's like, it's great if you want to colonize another planet. And when are we going to have the conversation of holding the space for what's happening here? And then harm has happened, right? That's coming up in a couple of these when you think about the suffering. Not just there's people suffering from it, but active harm has happened on this journey to where we're going. Harm will happen in the future. Not just the idealized state, not just that goal, you know. If you want to tie this back to the workouts, it's like me having a goal for how I want my body to look and how thinking I can do that work through exercising every day, but not wanting to address or acknowledge what's going to come with the regimen, right? That's set in those goals. And so it's important to think about here. It's necessary to think about here. Because oftentimes when we come into a space where we can do an idealized vision of a greater future without acknowledging these harms, without acknowledging the present, it's easy, especially for those with privilege, to ignore or minimize or deprioritize the people that will be hurt most. That's how we got here, right? Slavery was justified, right? It was the means to an economic end. It's what we need. It was the necessary steps for the foundation of America. We had Republican leaders say that last year, right? So it's important for us to be present in this. And as you know from a mindfulness practice, that in order for us to be responsive and not reactive, in order to not just jump to the goal of being safe, we need to be present, right? From a physiological perspective, to be present in the moment is how we can self-regulate, is how we can process information, and is how we can move from stimulus to response. So when I was putting this together, this conversation, when I have this conversation, I feel like it's a big circle. And every time I do it, I start at a different part of it because I do feel like it all comes back, right? So let's talk about how we do this work. Let's talk about how we create a responsive anti-racism practice, right? Because if we keep doing what we do after the murder of, or the violence against communities of color, we'll never get to a system that can actually serve us all. And so I offer questions and inquiries that we can be in. You know, the first thing, like I mentioned, is really analyzing our relationship to the stimulus that comes in. Most of the time, a lot of reactive, we react to racism in America because there's very few stimulus that gets national attention. So one thing I recommend is, how are we recognizing as individuals and collectively the systemic inequities and more stimulus, the racial disparities of more stimulus, right? That's one way for us to become to a more responsive state. Because George Floyd and Tamir Rice and Eric Garner are names of countless, or some of countless people that have lost their lives because of racial violence, particularly from law enforcement. So how are we recognizing this more often? It's part of what the newsletter aims to do, is look at the racial disparities of almost anything that's happening. It's no mistake that most of the communities that have gone without power for 3 days and counting in Austin right now are communities of color, families with lower income. Not because somebody woke up and decided that, or potentially they did, I can't speak for them, but certainly we know it's because of how neighborhoods have been zoned, access to housing, our relationship with healthcare and healthcare facilities in lower income communities. So what you see there is not just one, we can react to one act of racial injustice, but it doesn't respond to all of the systemic inequities I named. All right. So how are we continuing to recognize that in the stimulus so we don't have this huge reaction in that moment? We stay more educated and informed. Oops. Who is and or what shapes our default responses? I want you to think about this. What is shaping how we respond to racism in America? And I would say, like, what is shaping our default reactions here? But even as we get to responses, we want to know that we're not just responding to what's happening in that moment, but we're doing it in a way that is equitable. So how do we do that? You know, if we think about like what we learn on how to respond in the moment in terms of wellness, in terms of, you know, maybe feeling our feet on the floor or taking a deep breath in through our nose and a deep breath out, we have those practices. So what are our practices in the moment of systemic injustice? You know, are we just donating to bail funds? Or are we actively addressing the issue of cash bail? Are we posting about something on social media the moment that it happens? Or are we committed to having an ongoing conversation with our communities? And so we can learn these things. We can create new default responses, but it takes us actively learning them from someone or something. So we need to figure out if there's a who are those people, right? Are we just going to wait for, you know, for example, like a political leader? Because, you know, a lot of people learned how to respond to things in the way that Trump, our president, chose to respond to things. And is that the response, the reaction that we choose, right? Think about other leaders that you may not consider that can help navigate these times, like your community leaders where you live, like activists, abolitionists, right? So in the same way, you may have your wellness teachers. Who are your teachers in these moments, helping to shape responses? And I have what here, which is looking not just at individuals and their leadership, but resources, books, podcasts, I mean, you name it. But really thinking about who's shaping our default responses. And you can think about this at anywhere. You can think about this in any aspect of your life, any moment in your well-being. I highly encourage to be considering just with your own wellness practices, who you're learning from and who's teaching those practices. How do you stay resourced proactively to be in these conversations, right? A big thing that happens when we respond reactively to anti-racism, we're doing it from an unresourced state. And resources can be really broad. It can be, we're putting ourselves we're trying to respond with our money, but it might happen on a day that you don't have money in the bank, right? When we're responding reactively, it doesn't mean we're prepared. We might be really tired, hungry, you name it. We might be out of information. We'll talk about how information makes us information, right? Puts us organized, right? Whereas disinformation is not what we're talking about here. And we'll get into that. But how are we getting resourced with the tools that we need to respond proactively, you know? Because oftentimes our reactions are so different from how we would be if we were resourced. And also, how are we resourced reactively? Because it's important to name that there's always going to be a time for a reaction, right? We have to react to what's happening here in Texas right now. And so we need to know how to stay resourced, you know, all the time. And we also need to know how to be more resourced when we can be placed in a reactive state, right? If you know mindfulness practices, you might have that for your own. Is like, you have, you know, a practice that you can do or that you may be able to do when you're in a reactive state, you know? Mine's always just like stop, right? Mine is literally like, you know, help me stop moving the body, reduce the stimulus around me, you know, open my eyes, look at something, take deep breaths. So how do we stay resourced in both of those ways for this work? Oops, was that the last one here? That's right. Yep. Okay. And then how do we get resourced for the discomfort that arises in this work? Because a lot of times people don't engage in anti-racism work because it's uncomfortable. And I'll go a step further to note that the people that choose not to engage in anti-racism work oftentimes has the privilege not to, right? I did not become an anti-racism educator or facilitator because that's what I wanted to do when I grew up. I wanted to be a cab driver when I was little because my favorite color was yellow, and cab drivers were in New York City and I thought New York City was cool. I didn't wake up to do this work. But as a Black woman in the wellness space who's experienced racism, very public acts of racism, this became my work, right? This became a place, and I chose to step into it, but this became a part of my work. Now I'm all the way in. So how do we get resource for all of us to be in this work and be in a state of discomfort, right? A lot of that comes from before, right? Like how are we resourced to respond proactively? But it also means that, like, being resourced for the discomfort in the moment. One, I like this name, is how are we prepared for acknowledging harm? How are we prepared for apologizing? And a white supremacist culture, the idea of apologizing, of acknowledging that we're wrong, it is a very patriarchal, actually, perspective, right? We're taught that leaders always have to know the right things to say, to have the right information, that leaders can't admit that they've done wrong because they will lose power. But that's not how we move forward, right? It gives us a free pass to hurt without accountability. It oftentimes keeps us out of community, out of conversation. And so how are we prepared for acknowledging harm? One thing I wrote is apologizing. The art of apologizing goes beyond saying I'm sorry and is oftentimes not taught. Karen said intent is not equal to impact, which is another part of this. How do we start to acknowledge that just because we don't mean to harm anybody, that we don't have to hold ourselves accountable for the impact, you know? And it's funny because we actually do live in a system that promotes that, right? If I'm driving down the street, I don't intend to rear end somebody, but if I do rear end somebody, right, I can't just apologize and walk away. But oftentimes, because we have insurance and like our insurance is supposed to handle this thing for us, if you do have insurance, that's a systemic practice that takes away that accountability. And somebody else named, it's very easy for those to be afraid to be accountable, even though it's what's right. But it's not taught. There's a study that shows that politicians lose political power if they admit that they're wrong. And that it's recommended by political analysts to encourage people not to apologize. And I don't know if you've been noticing, there's been a lot of calls for accountability from leaders that rarely apologize. That is a trained, researched response, you know, of people saying that it's the system, of people putting either blame or accountability on another organization. That is trained and practiced and normalized in our culture. I'm not saying it's right, but it's important for us to remember our roles as individuals and our roles as a collective to get resourced for this, because it's oftentimes not going to be provided to us. All right. We talk a lot about intent versus impact. There's a lot of incredible work. Mia Mingus has an apology lab that I highly recommend. You can read some of the resources that they have online and try to go to one of those courses. What is our practice for engaging in conflict? Because similar to what we've learned about being right or being wrong, we've learned to avoid when conflict comes up in relationship, right? We've been taught that any kind of conflict is oftentimes somebody that's angry or violent. Mia Mingus, I'll make sure this will be sent out as a resource, but it's MIA and then MINGUS. Our practice for engaging in conflict needs to be cultivated. And I'm not trying to say that means that you know how to throw hands. My point is we need to know how to navigate a difficult conversation. We need to recognize how to stay in relationship when things get tough. This is not to the point of trauma or physical harm, right? There's clear boundaries that we need to put up for ourselves in moments in relationship. But I'm talking about how some people feel privileged not to engage with people that don't feel the same way that they do about Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. I'm talking about the tension that you may feel about not saying or speaking up for racial inequities at your office. So what is our practice for engaging in conflict? How can we cultivate that? How can we learn more nuances and engaging in conflict resolution, mediation, restorative justice, right? Here's the other thing about conflict is that we're taught a very carceral system of how we engage with one another. We're taught that punishment is the way that we learn, right? Instead of centering the harm, instead of acknowledging our wrong. It kind of goes into the point before. So how can we shift what we've been taught to recreate the system that we want to live in? How can we dismantle our notions of what feelings, sensations, emotions are useful or helpful in a moment? This is a particular one I add when I talk about wellness, because we're oftentimes taught to regulate our emotions, to minimize our emotional responses through some of the practices that are popularized in wellness, right? Overcoming sadness or anger. We talk about anger management a lot, especially for kids. Oftentimes that's used in a way to control, how we show up in space with one another. It could be really harmful. It has been really harmful for communities of color, in particular for Black people and other marginalized folk, And so I really like to think about in the discomfort is how can we dismantle our concepts of useful and helpful emotions? How can we listen when people are mad? How can we hold space for the deep sadness and grief that so many of us individually and collectively are experiencing? There's a term in anti-racism work called tone policing, where we say, well, I'm not going to listen to you because you seem a little bit mad. Maybe if you were calmer when you said that, you would reach more people, right? It takes away somebody's ability to process some difficult, harmful emotions, particularly those who are marginalized and or victimized. And it oftentimes also takes off or disempowers us from the energy that these sensations and feelings can offer. And this is if we choose, because again, I know a lot of people like myself use deep breathing to mitigate anxiety that I really would prefer not to feel all the time, but how are we making sure that we're dismantling those notions as a whole so people can show up more in their full selves? That means getting uncomfortable if someone's angry. Their anger just might be the face of their fear or their shame, their perceived lack of safety. Maybe they are angry because they want things to change. So how can we dismantle that as part of our relationship to discomfort, not just for other people or for ourselves? They see just pure passion. You're just really passionate. I get loud when I get passionate. That's what I do. So how can that is a discomfort that we individually and collectively need to change, right? Well, the last thing I want to name is how do we detach from the results? I know I'm over time, I'm going to go quick. We talk a lot in the mindfulness space about the relationship between practice and non-attachment. How do we do things every day and be as unattached as possible from the outcome? It's kind of similar to what we talked about with goal-oriented work earlier on, and holding space for what's in front of us than just the vision. This is incredibly important in anti-racism work because a lot of us have been taught that if it doesn't create change now, it is not relevant or important or enough for our time and our energy. You know, I'm a millennial. We like to get things right away. We stop watching a video after 3 seconds or whatever the stat is. So how do we detach ourselves from the results of this work and make the journey, the movement, the transformation itself the most important thing, the here and the now? Often, this is very important for people with privilege because people with privilege oftentimes will not directly benefit from some of the work that's happening today. So therefore, it can feel less important. Right? If you're donating to mutual aid networks in Austin because you have the financial privilege to, because you're in the safety of it, you might not feel what that $100 is doing in your community. And so therefore, or you say you donated from Minnesota, you might not feel like it's important. But the 5 people that can eat a hot meal tonight because of that money will. So it's really important to detach ourselves from the results there, right? Because we might not feel them in the moment. We might not see them in our lifetime. So would our work change if change was impossible? How would your perspective on anti-racism change if you went 2,000 years in the future and found out it never changed? Would you stop? And if you would, why? Yeah, some great conversations around detachment in the comments too. How would your work change if change became impossible? And I don't believe that. I know that change is possible. I know that I'm here because my ancestors believed that change was possible. I am a living representation that change is possible. But how would your work change? How do you stay committed to this work beyond your lifetime? What does that take for you? You know, I've watched speeches of MLK and Fred Hampton, who both named publicly that they knew they would be killed for their work days before they were. And they still did that work until the moment that they died. And so how do you stay committed to work beyond your lifetime? And the last thing I'll name on this is, how do you stay committed to this work when it gets harder? I didn't write this. I think the most important thing we need to remember is that this work, the immediate work of addressing anti-racism in the next few years in America, is going to be some of the toughest work that we have done in our lifetime, in our nation's lifetime. And so how do you stay in it now? How do you stay in it after the Trump administration and all the way through the Biden and what is coming next? Because we needed us yesterday. The second best time to do that is now. And so I'm going to open this up for questions. This is a conversation that I will continue to have in my work. I'm excited to continue to have this conversation with you in the next few minutes. A couple of thought starters. You don't have to ask questions or share this, but note how this is landing for you in your body right now. Note what feelings and sensations may be present for you and what feels resonant. And you can find more of my work at the links below. I'm more than happy to continue this conversation with you there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Nicole. And if you'll take your slides down,
Of course.
There are amazing questions that have come up. And I'm so grateful for your presentation today, and so are the comments. And I know you've been seeing some of the comments as they have come through, but I think
Just a
people
couple.
have just been deeply touched really by the conversation today. So the first question I'm going to ask came through our chat. How can a BIPOC person be safe and not feel overwhelmed when we often are put in positions of educating and reinforcing white fragility as we pursue our own self-care?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that's something I ask myself every day, especially as I get more into a more public in this work. So thank you for asking that and holding space for it. I think one thing I've tried to carry with me is that me showing up is an act of revolution. Me being in this space is an act of revolution, right? Me caring for myself is that too, right? Audre Lorde's birthday is today, and I always go back to their work. I also, want to name, operating and navigating through white fragility is not your burden to carry, right? I want to make it clear that like racism is a problem that really is up to white people to address and to carry forward. And so you do what you can, and then you resource yourself where you need to. I'm not sure about safety, but I think it's how can we create the safest spaces we can, and how can we resource ourselves to be the most brave.
Thank you for that, Nicole. What would you say to people who feel burnt out from constantly recognizing the view and they're starting to lose sight of the vision?
Yeah, it's a good question. It can be really burned. You can get really burned out by just focusing there. I think that imagination is critical. I think it's about both. I think it's about navigating both spaces, becoming informed about the vision, sitting with the vision every day, just not losing sight of today. It's a balance, but it's something I struggle with a lot too. So sometimes I just have my own space for visualizing. I just journal, I write out what I want, how I want things to feel, what it'll feel like in my body for hopefully my grandkids and my great grandkids. I don't even know if I'll have kids, but I like to spend that time in the visioning state. And then I return. That really helps.
So this next question, Nicole, is one that I sure struggle with as well, and it showed up a couple of times. How do multiple truths and disinformation intersect?
Yeah, so
So we
multiple
live in a
truths.
world where both exist.
Yeah, so multiple truths are truths that are we know at our core to be right, right? Your truth about how you feel about you, what your identity is, and how you show up. That to me is a truth. What we see a lot with disinformation are people actively wielding information to influence somebody else's truth. So I don't consider disinformation a truth. That's a terminology definition thing. But disinformation is really insidious because it can become other people's truths. And so I always tend to look at why do people engage in conspiracy theories? Why do people resonate with disinformation? And it's usually because of a deeper truth. And we saw that with like the rise of QAnon during COVID. A lot of people were really isolated. A lot of people were scared. A lot of people felt like the community that they were a part of weren't giving them adequate answers. And those to me are their truths that I can connect with because I know how that feels, right? And I know how disinformation can shift it. So that's how I look at that. Is trying to get deeper to the truth there.
So there's a whole series of questions, Nicole, that really look at the whole issue of accountability. And so the first one, I think for some folks, it's hard to distinguish the difference between accountability and punishment because our systems are based on punishing folks rather than repairing harm.
That's right.
How do you define or explain accountability for folks in this work who are scared of doing harm as they learn and fear being called out?
Yeah, it's hard because holding people accountable can feel like a carceral form of punishment, right? And a lot of times we see that tension. We have a lot of people like me. I don't believe in prison. I don't believe in incarceration. And yet I do want to see the right people held to the fullest extent of the law, right? That is a tension and two opposing things that come together. And so what I would say is holding accountability or encouraging people to hold themselves accountable is the best that we can do. And that means informing them and educating them of that issue. Accountability is something that comes from ourselves, right? The carceral punishment system is something we very rarely opt into, right? As individuals. Most people don't wake up. It's very rare when you hear a story of somebody waking up and saying, please put me in jail for life, right? So that's how I think about the difference is if we can keep encouraging individual accountability, then we can bring that, we can bring that and foster that. However, in the interim, we're trying to do accountability work in a carceral system. And so that's a good question or inquiry to hold is what happens in those moments.
So Nicole, this question kind of, I think, builds on the whole issue of, accountability. And somebody writes, I don't know how familiar you are with the country singer Morgan Wallen and his recent apology, but what are your thoughts on what he said? And where does he go from here to make reparations? And just in case everybody listening doesn't know about Morgan Wallen, he did put out a video apologizing for an unacceptable and inappropriate racial slur that he wished he could take back, and said there are no excuses.
I think it's tense. I think that generally we're seeing a lot of people hold themselves accountable on a public platform to use themselves as an example and hopefully model, accountability from others moving forward. That, I think, in itself is a positive trait that we need to encourage, to continue and encourage, is saying like, hey, I messed up, right? I think further reparations are hard for me to say. I would say that it's easy to say that he might have to do reparations. I will call, like, what does it look like for his industry and for leaders as a whole to step up? I don't know him. I don't know the specific example, but it's easy to think that he should be responsible for solving systemic inequities around maybe his celebrity career, maybe how much easier it was for him to succeed, the systemic use of the racial slur. I'm assuming he used the N-word. So I would say, like, how much is on him and how much is on us to be calling that whole industry accountable.
Great point.
Yeah.
So this person writes, how can we authentically apologize or act to right the wrongs of our direct family ancestors? Should we focus more on the present and what we can do ourselves? What's the balance there?
Is this a question on, like, maybe somebody who might identify as white and be thinking about, like, their ancestry and
Sounds like
relation
Yep.
to slavery?
Yep.
I think that one, like, what can you do in the moment is most important, is how can you respond as an individual now? Certainly, if you have a direct line of reparations that you could do on behalf of your family, then I think definitely pursue that. But I know many of us don't. So it starts with you, is like, how can you carry this forward on behalf of those that came before you, for those that came after, right? And recognizing that you did not choose the same decisions as your ancestors, right? And the same way I didn't choose the same decisions as my ancestors. So where can you start? If you were looking directly at reparations, there are reparation movements happening in local communities across the country. So if that felt right to you, that could be a literal way that you could pay reparations. But you could also elevate, Black and Brown people in your community, pay their work forward, invest more time, and learn a lot more about, what's happened in your lineage and what else you can do.
So Nicole, this question goes back to your work in the wellness industry. And the question is, do you think the personal responsibility slant of wellness is a Western spin? Western, perhaps even American culture is very individualistic as compared to Eastern cultures, for example, where care of the collective or society is more common.
Yes. In short, yes, it seems to be personal responsibility is certainly a Westernized ideal, particularly when it comes into wellness and the way the practices have been co-opted for the Western wellness space have exemplified or exacerbated the individualism parts of the practice. So yes, I would also argue that a lot of that's happened here in Westernized because of trying take out spirituality and religion, which is oftentimes a tie to a greater community or collective part of a practice. So that's another thing, is like how we've kind of removed or minimized the spiritual aspects of the practices that we have here.
Mm-hmm. So the next question, Nicole, is when one actively seeks to be anti-racist and move an organization in that direction, how important is it to also name the other isms that we should be anti as well?
100%. There's no anti-racism work that's ableist. There's no anti-racism work that's homophobic. There's no anti-racism work that is, there's no anti-racism work that doesn't also look at the needs of other identities. I think that oftentimes gets lost in the conversation around anti-racism. And it's particularly from how corporations are formed. You'll have an employee resource group for every community. This has to be intersectional. This can't just be for supporting marginalized racial and ethnic identities, but marginalized racial and ethnic identities that are also disabled, that are also trans, that are also larger bodied. So absolutely. Intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw is a really important terminology to learn. I would also learn about the work of Barbara Smith in terms of centering diverse communities. Johnny Lacey is an incredible Black disabled advocate who brought this up in their work in the 60s too.
I want to honor this next question because it comes from a college student. As a college student who is a person of color and who wants to go into health promotion and wellness, how can I make sure that I'm heard around older people who are white, just because the field is predominantly white?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, you know, what I was taught growing up was to be as white as possible so that my work would be accepted and so that I would be able to be successful professionally. That was what my parents taught me because that's what they were taught, right? Is to assimilate into dominant culture as much as possible. And it gave me privilege and power that I have, especially because I'm, you know, thinner, I'm able-bodied, I'm a light-skinned Black woman. I'm approachable. It did give me some privileges, but it also didn't change the systemic inequities that I face, right? So I would say, be you. And if people don't listen to you, then they're not your community. I think one thing that it's easy to forget is that we are the fastest growing demographic in the wellness space. We have the most need. We spend on average more. I don't think we need these kind of metrics to justify our existence, but they are also there. And so please be you. And hold that space for you and hold that space for all the people like you that don't see themselves in the community that you're coming up against. I'll be there for you.
Such a powerful answer, Nicole. Thank you for that. This person writes, I feel that universities need to hold themselves accountable to having structures that create unsafe and anxiety and depression provoking environments for students. How can university wellness centers, counseling services, et cetera, start to recognize this instead of just offering services that treat symptoms while being part of the system creating harm?
A good question. We need that everywhere. So what you're asking from a university perspective, I think is the same question we need to be asking in politics, in public transportation, in the workplace, in any other space. How does our idea of wellness services go towards actually dismantling the existing inequities? And I would say that it starts with asking for those resources. So making sure that it's not just, you know, a meditation room, but there's actual, maybe like a mutual aid network within your university that's offering care, you know, like money for food and shelter. I would just keep pushing that and demanding it. And I think we're getting there. I think we're starting to have that conversation. I mean, like y'all having me and the kinds of conversations that you hold here are looking at wellness beyond that.
How can we discourage racial cliques in our youth more in order to encourage more interracial relationships, or is that potentially harmful?
Racial cliques. It's a tricky one. I think that what we're seeing right now happen, especially with younger groups, are affinity groups, which are people bonding together because of shared experiences around their identities. I don't think that is inherently harmful. To have people connected and feel resourced and safe, because I do think we need those spaces. You know, as a Black woman, there's a sense of solidarity and safety I feel being around other Black women. I think that if we're in those spaces, it's up to us to also be holding conversations on how we support those communities, even if they're not literally in the room, right? How are we in community with other affinity groups? How are we being equitable? Even if we're holding that space for like, you know, an hour a week to be with ourselves. You know, we're having that conversation right now. You know, I work in anti-Blackness and I'm centered in anti-Blackness as a Black woman. There's a lot of conversations happening between the Asian community and the Black community around the rise of anti-Asian violence that's been perpetuated by a lot of Black people. And so I think it's both. It's like, how can we be with one another when we need to? And how can we also hold space for one another at the same time?
Mhm. This person writes, I have so much trouble moving from theory to practice. How do I push for anti-racism beyond my own classroom? How do I affect change on institutions, the police, banking, medicine that I'm not involved in?
Show up, show up. I think one thing is recognizing that like where you bank, where you spend your money matters. That makes a big difference. So if you don't like what you're seeing at your bank, leave your bank. Show up to local, community gatherings around police. If you can go physically to a protest, show up. And all of the things that you can do outside, you can also model in your own. I forgot where you said if you're a teacher, where was their core space?
Yeah,
Teacher?
it was a teacher, a faculty
Yeah.
member.
So like, if you're a teacher or a faculty member, model that in your classroom and do that work where you can outside of it. These are very interconnected systems, right? So if you're looking at reimagining public safety, that's going to change law enforcement, and that's probably also going to support your school.
I have a few more questions, Nicole, to
Sure.
ask, but I just have to say, I have never seen the chat so rich in sharing of resources. When we will capture the chat, it's amazing. The expertise, the creativity, the ideas that, people have been adding. So thank you all for that.
Yes, I just want to name, I'm saying things quick and y'all are like picking up on it and putting it in there. So thank you.
It
Keep
feels
going.
like such an active exchange. It really does. It's fun today. So this person is working in worksite wellness and says that she sees so many health tracking programs that are shame-oriented and goal-oriented, and she doesn't agree with those. Would you say that these health programs that superimpose goals on participants, would you see those as being racist?
I wouldn't see them as inherently racist, but I can see them as oppressive. I mean, it depends. If your community is asking for goals and they're making goals together, then yes, oftentimes goal-oriented work tends to center how somebody with privilege, usually who's able-bodied, usually who's white, oftentimes who's male, etc., can reach those goals. So it doesn't necessarily, it might take me longer to get to a goal than it might take you to get to a goal, just based on our own lived experiences. It could be racist. It could be straight up racist. We have a whole conversation around how the BMI, for example, has been designed around white bodies, and that's very different and has been weaponized against the Black community and other communities of color, especially those larger bodied. So it can be, but I would say, is it offering space for everybody to be seen and heard? Is it really responsive to what their needs are in that moment? Will I be punished if I don't achieve those goals because I can't get to that wellness workspace right now because it's probably flooded in Austin, right? So that's the more of the conversation there. Somebody had asked, I saw it pop up, what carceral meant. That's from the word like incarceration. So if you heard me say carceral, it's kind of weird. It might not sound like how it's spelled, but it's talking about carceral practices or practices that are represented in our incarcerated system. Okay. And so sometimes that can come up with goal setting too. If you don't do this, then you are punished, right? Instead of we will respond to you and your needs.
So somebody asks, what do you suggest to begin integrating helping a community that I just moved into?
Oh, I think it's so important to get as involved as you can when you just move in. First, it might be recognizing your privilege for moving to that community if you so had it, right? Because that happens a lot with gentrification and how that can offset and displace communities. So I would just see like who is the most vulnerable where you live, right? It's usually pretty simple to get into a practice when you're new somewhere, when you're establishing your own practice. So maybe as you figure out where your grocery store is and your favorite coffee shop, you're also figuring out the closest shelter, the closest food bank, the closest emergency center, and then to figure out what mutual aid networks are there or local community organizers are advocating for. It's a really powerful way to get involved. And so I'm excited for you to have that new opportunity.
Great suggestions. This person writes, do therapy techniques like using I statements help with engaging in conflict? I'm wondering how much conventional therapy communication techniques could also be full of unexamined structural racism.
Yeah. I am not an expert in the therapy field, so I can't just say specifics, but I know that there's conversations on both sides. So therapy practices that are designed and center people with power and privilege that are often white, that also often have communication techniques that are normalized, right? I think about, for example, how like Black people being angry is oftentimes something that's kind of pushed down or tried to be tampered in therapy, because the idea of Black people being angry isn't seen as good. But what I will say on the other hand are things like I statements are really important, because they oftentimes just help us identify and speak from our own worldviews. It means that we're not applying unconscious biases to the other person. And it also just helps to be vulnerable, right? And name what's happening for us. Can that also be weaponized? Of course. But I think that question that you're asking is a great place to stay in inquiry.
So, Nicole, how do you maintain your wellness when someone doesn't respect your boundaries?
I try to minimize positions where I'm placed for my boundaries to be harmed. So that's my first thing, is being really proactive, right? I used to say yes to a lot more things than I do now. I used to open a lot more emails. I used to have it easier for people to contact me directly. So that was my first thing, was like creating some proactive boundaries. Oftentimes what I do if my boundaries have been harmed is I give myself space to retreat, especially I think as marginalized people, we oftentimes aren't granted that from other people. So I like outside community. There's always like a demand for our time, a demand for our energy. So that's my first thing. I kind of retreat back, I find refuge where I need to. And then I choose how I want to respond.
So, Nicole, this is the last question I'm going to ask. You have been incredibly forthcoming and patient with the long list of questions, and I think we could go on for a long time. In the chat, there have just been so many thank yous, hundreds of thank yous, and people writing about how you've, touched them. And this question that I am going to ask begins with a thank you. It says, more than a question, just thank you, Nicole, for being innately good, for building beauty wherever you go, and for being able to see the truths. My question, as someone who is striving and fumbling to be anti-racist, is how do you cross the emotional divide? For example, most anti-racist work is emotionally based in care and fairness, but the opposition is more driven by loyalty, authority, and sanctity. I don't know if my question makes sense, so you can dismiss it. I guess I'm just wondering how Nicole finds common emotional ground when working with uncommon lives.
This is my opinion. I can't speak for everybody in this work. But what I always come back to is that we're all responding from the same feelings of safety and security and our fear of not having it. So I think that, a lot of times people will come back like what you said, like with like lies, or they'll use policy examples or things that feel less heartful. I just think that there's some deep emotions buried underneath that. That's what I keep thinking about, is how must people feel so afraid of having power and benefiting from power from hundreds of years and feel that taken away. I don't know what that feels like, because I've never had that kind of power, but I do know I want to feel more of an equilibrium. And if they're on the other end of the seesaw, they're falling just as quickly as I'm rising, right? And we're both feeling that shift in energy. And so I just think about this is a deep, heartfelt work. And I'm trying to make space for all of our emotions and all of our feelings, so we all feel safer. And I believe we do that through anti-racism work. And if they're not feeling that yet, that's okay. I'll carry that, and I'll do this work for those that are.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole, for your presence with us today, and even more for all the amazing work that you're doing in the world. I want to thank all of you today who joined us for the webinar. And I also want to call out and thank the staff at the Bakken Center, especially Molly Buss, who masterfully managed all of the details of today's webinar. Today's free lecture was made possible through the generosity of our university and community sponsors, We appreciate their commitment to the health and well-being of people in Minnesota and around the world. We hope you'll join us for our upcoming webinars. On July 21st, Dr. Julianne Holt-Lundstedt will speak on loneliness and the clinical and public health importance of social well-being. And on October 20th, Dr. Andrew Williams will give a presentation titled Afro Blue, Dreams of Freedom, Racial Reconciliation, and Healing Justice. Thank you all for being with us today. Have a good day.